All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're looking at a really critical safety directive for one of the most modern jets up in the sky, the Airbus A220. It's a fascinating story about how a tiny manufacturing flaw in the plane's insulation led to a mandatory fix for hundreds of these aircraft.
So how can a tiny little gap in a plane's skin possibly be a huge risk? It's a great question, right? Because when we think about plane safety, our minds usually go to the big stuff, the engines, the wings, but sometimes the biggest risks are hidden in the smallest details. And in this case, a gap you could barely notice is what triggered this mandatory order for hundreds of planes all around the world.
So the official call came from Transport Canada. They issued what's called an Airworthiness Directive, which is, well, it's essentially a mandatory recall, but for airplanes. They put a firm deadline on it, starting September 2025, telling airlines they have to fix this specific unsafe condition on their A220 fleets.
Okay, so what exactly did they find? This brings us right to the technical heart of the issue, something called the 6-inch safety gap. It's a really subtle flaw, one that engineers discovered, but boy, does it violate a fundamental principle of fire safety on an aircraft.
The whole problem is about these things called cabin insulation blankets. Now, you might think they're just there to keep the cabin warm, and yeah, they do that. But their most critical job is actually safety. They're designed to be a fire barrier, meant to slow down a fire on the outside from ever getting through to the passenger cabin. And everything comes down to this one number, 6 inches. See, for that fire barrier to actually work, every single blanket has to overlap the one next to it by at least 6 inches. This isn't just a suggestion. It's a core safety standard the plane needs to meet for certification. It's all about making sure there are absolutely no weak points in that shield.
And here's where you see the difference between the design and what actually happened. The design requires that continuous 6-inch overlap, but on some of the early production planes, engineers found a problem. At a very specific spot on the plane's frame, known as stringer 23 on the left-hand side, the overlap just wasn't enough. And that tiny gap meant a break in the plane's critical fire barrier.
So you have to ask, why does this small gap matter so much? Well, this is where we go from a technical flaw to some very serious real-world consequences, specifically in the worst-case scenario you can imagine, a fire after a crash.
This quote comes directly from the safety directive, and it really doesn't mince words. That gap isn't just a small issue, it's a pathway. It's a pathway that could let a fire burn through into the cabin much, much faster than it's designed to. And that directly affects the most precious thing you have in an emergency, time. Specifically, the time to get everybody out.
You see, the danger is a direct threat to that critical window of time. With the proper 6-inch overlap, passengers have a certain amount of time to evacuate in a post-crash fire. But with that little gap, the fire can break through the barrier faster. That means the time available to get everyone out safely gets a whole lot shorter. Every single second counts, and this flaw literally steals those seconds away.
Now, the good news is, once a problem like this is found, the system moves really fast to fix it. And that brings us to the solution, a clear, methodical, and totally mandatory plan to get the A220 safety barrier back to its original design standard.
And the investigation was incredibly precise. They pinpointed the exact aircraft affected. This directive covers early production models of both the A220-100 and the larger A220-300, and they identified them right down to a specific range of serial numbers.
The fix itself is actually very straightforward, laid out in 4 clear steps. First, airlines have to identify which of their planes fall into those serial number ranges. Second, they order the new correctly made blankets. Third, during a scheduled maintenance check, they take out the old, non-compliant ones. And finally, they install the new parts, following the official Airbus service bulletin.
And the deadline is strict. Kicking off in September 2025, airlines have to get this fix done within 36 months or 7,500 flight hours. The key part there is whichever occurs first. That makes sure that the planes that are flying the most get fixed the fastest, which really shows you the urgency of the issue.
So what does all of this mean in the grand scheme of things? While it might seem a little alarming to hear about a flaw in a modern jet, this story is actually a perfect example of the aviation safety system working exactly the way it's supposed to.
So the real takeaway here isn't about a mistake, it's about a system that works. You have proactive engineering teams that are constantly looking for potential issues, even tiny ones. When they find something, regulators like Transport Canada step in and issue a mandatory fix for everyone. And the airlines, well, they have no choice but to comply if they want to keep flying that plane. It just proves that safety isn't a one-time thing. It is a continuous, relentless process of improvement.
And that leaves us with a final thought. This whole issue was about an invisible 6-inch overlap of insulation that no passenger would ever see. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other unseen, meticulously designed safety features are working right now to protect you every single time you fly?